The silence of the cemetery stretched longer than any prayer as Margaret Elsworth knelt beside the freshly turned earth, her black mourning dress pooling in the dust around her, like spilled ink beneath the harsh Arizona sun. 3 days had passed since they buried her son Thomas in this lonely plot overlooking Oatman, and 3 days she had returned at dawn to keep watch over his grave, as if her presence could somehow anchor his spirit to this world a little longer. The wind carried the scent of creosote and sand across the hillside cemetery, and in the distance she could hear the faint sounds of the mining town coming to life, men heading to the gold claims that had drawn so many to this unforgiving land. Margaret was only 32 years old, though grief had carved lines around her eyes that made her look older. Her husband had died 2 years prior in a mining accident, leaving her and Thomas to fend for themselves. The boy had been just 16 then, forced to become the man of their small household, working odd jobs around town to keep food on their table. Now he too was gone, taken by a fever that had swept through Oatman like wildfire, claiming a dozen souls in as many days. She traced her fingers along the wooden cross that marked his resting place, her lips moving in silent conversation with a son who could no longer answer. The morning light painted the distant mountains in shades of copper and gold, beautiful and indifferent to human suffering. Margaret barely noticed. Her world had narrowed to this patch of earth, this final connection to the child she had carried and raised and loved. The sound of boots crunching on gravel made her lift her head. A man was approaching from the cemetery entrance, tall and lean, moving with the easy gait of someone accustomed to long hours in the saddle. He wore dusty trail clothes and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face, and for a moment Margaret tensed, wondering if she should be afraid. A woman alone in a cemetery was vulnerable, and while Oatman was generally law-abiding, the wild territory attracted all sorts. But as he drew closer, she saw something in his bearing that eased her worry. He removed his hat as he approached, revealing a face weathered by sun and wind, with dark hair that needed cutting and brown eyes that held a deep sadness she recognized, because she saw it in her own mirror each morning. "Madam," he said quietly, his voice rough as if unused to speaking. "I do not mean to intrude. I saw you here yesterday and the day before. Thought maybe you could use some company." Margaret studied him, this stranger who had noticed her grief. "I am not certain I am fit company for anyone," she said, her voice hoarse from crying and lack of use. "Neither am I," he replied. "Maybe that makes us suitable for each other." Something about his honesty, the lack of empty platitudes that everyone else offered, made her gesture to the ground beside her. "You may sit if you wish." He lowered himself to the earth with a slight grimace, as if his body carried old injuries. For a long moment, they sat in silence, two souls keeping vigil together. Margaret found the quiet companionship oddly comforting. This stranger made no demands on her, offered no meaningless assurances that time would heal or God had a plan. "My name is Henry Dalton," he finally said. "I have been working on the Mitchell Ranch about 5 miles south of town." "Margaret Elsworth," she answered. "This is my son Thomas." He was 18 years old. Henry looked at the grave with understanding. "Too young." "Any age would have been too young," Margaret said, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "He was all I had left in this world." Henry reached into his vest and pulled out a clean handkerchief, offering it to her without a word. The simple kindness undid something in Margaret's chest, and she wept openly, not the restrained tears of public mourning but deep, wrenching sobs that came from the very center of her being. When the storm passed, she found Henry still sitting beside her, patient and steady as stone. She wiped her eyes with his handkerchief, embarrassed by her display but also strangely relieved. "I apologize. You did not come here to witness a stranger fall apart." "Actually, I came here for my own reasons," Henry said. He pointed to a grave 3 rows down marked with a simple stone. "My brother is buried there, Jacob Dalton. He died 6 months ago." Margaret looked at the weathered stone, then back at Henry. "I am sorry for your loss, and I for yours." He met her eyes, and in that moment, Margaret felt truly seen for the first time since Thomas died. Not pitied, not judged, but understood by someone who walked the same dark road of grief. They sat together as the sun climbed higher, occasionally speaking but mostly existing in shared silence. Henry told her that his brother had been thrown from a horse, breaking his neck instantly. Jacob had been younger by 3 years, always reckless, always pushing boundaries. Henry had been working in Nevada when it happened and had not arrived until 2 days after the burial. Coming to the grave was his way of making up for that absence, though he knew it changed nothing. Margaret found herself telling Henry about Thomas, about his quick smile and his determination to take care of her after his father died. She told him how the boy had loved horses and had dreamed of saving enough money to start his own ranch someday. She spoke of his final days, the fever that burned him up from the inside, how she had sat beside his bed and tried to will her own strength into his failing body. "The doctor said there was nothing to be done," she whispered. "I felt so helpless. A mother should be able to protect her child." "Some things are beyond anyone's power to stop," Henry said gently. "That does not make you less of a mother, it just makes you human." The words settled over her like a bomb. Everyone else in town had tried to comfort her with religion or philosophy, but Henry simply acknowledged the terrible truth of loss and offered no false hope that it could have been different. As the day wore on, Henry showed no sign of leaving. When the sun reached its zenith and the heat became oppressive, he walked down to the town and returned with a canteen of cool water and some bread and cheese wrapped in cloth. "You need to eat," he said simply. Margaret wanted to refuse, but her body betrayed her with a loud rumble of hunger. She could not remember her last proper meal. She accepted the food and found that once she started eating, she was ravenous. Henry ate sparingly, giving her the larger portion without making it obvious. "You have people in town?" he asked. "Family or friends?" "My husband had a cousin who lives on the other side of Oatman, but we were never close. Most of the neighbors have been kind, bringing food and such, but I cannot seem to make myself go back to the house. It is so empty now." Henry nodded. "The Mitchell Ranch keeps me busy most days, but I have been coming here each morning before work. Something about this place, it lets me breathe a little easier. Like Jacob is still closed somehow." "Yes," Margaret said, grateful that he understood. "That is exactly how I feel." As afternoon shadows began lengthening across the cemetery, Henry finally stood, groaning slightly as his knees protested. "I should get back to the ranch, but I will be here tomorrow morning if you are." Margaret looked up at him, this unexpected companion in her sorrow. "I will be here." He settled his hat back on his head and started to walk away, then paused and turned back. "Mrs. Elsworth, you should not be alone in your grief. It is a heavy thing to carry by yourself." "You seem to manage," she said. "No, madam, I just hide it better." With that honest admission, he touched the brim of his hat and walked away, his boots crunching on the gravel path. Margaret watched him go, feeling something stir in the numb cocoon that had wrapped around her heart. Not hope exactly, but perhaps the smallest seed of it. The possibility that life might continue, that she might find a reason to keep moving forward even though her world had ended. That evening, for the first time since Thomas died, Margaret went home before full dark. The small house they had rented on the edge of Oatman felt cavernous and silent, Thomas's presence everywhere and nowhere at once. His boots still sat by the door. His jacket hung on its peg. She walked through the rooms as if in a dream, touching his things, remembering. But she also built up the fire in the stove and heated water for tea. She ate some of the food the neighbors had brought. She washed her face and hands and changed out of the dress she had worn for 3 straight days. Small acts of self-care that felt monumental. That night, she lay in her bed and thought about Henry Dalton. There was something solid about him, something that made her feel less adrift. His eyes held the same loss she felt, and perhaps that was why his presence comforted rather than oppressed. He asked nothing of her except to exist as she was. True to his word, Henry was at the cemetery the next morning when Margaret arrived. He sat on the ground near Jacob's grave, his hat beside him, his head bowed. She approached quietly, not wanting to disturb his private moment, but he heard her and looked up. "Good morning, Mrs. Elsworth." "Good morning, Mr. Dalton, and please call me Margaret. Then you should call me Henry." He stood and walked with her to Thomas's grave, and they settled into their now familiar positions, keeping watch together. This became their pattern. Each morning before dawn, they would meet at the cemetery. Sometimes they talked, sharing memories of the ones they had lost. Other times they sat in comfortable silence, 2 people keeping vigil for those who had gone ahead. Henry always brought water and food, and Margaret began to bring coffee in a tin pot, still warm from her stove. The people of Oatman began to notice. In a small mining town, everything was noticed and discussed. Margaret heard the whispers at the general store, saw the sidelong glances when she walked down the street. The widow and the cowboy, meeting each dawn in the cemetery. It was scandalous, some said. It was touching, others argued. It was too soon, most agreed. Margaret did not care. For the first time since Thomas died, she had something to look forward to each day. Henry's steady presence gave her an anchor point, a reason to get out of bed when grief threatened to pull her under. She began to eat regularly again to take care of herself, because she knew Henry would notice if she did not. Henry, for his part, seemed equally drawn to their morning meetings. He told her more about his life, about growing up in Texas with Jacob, about their parents who had died in a cholera outbreak when the boys were young. They had raised each other, 2 brothers against the world, until Jacob's death had left Henry utterly alone. "I have been drifting since he died," Henry admitted one morning about 2 weeks after they first met. "Working ranch to ranch, never staying long. Figured maybe I could outrun the grief if I kept moving." "Can you?" Margaret asked. "No, it follows everywhere." He looked at her with those sad brown eyes. "But sitting here with you, talking about it instead of running from it, that helps. You help." Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I am glad. You have helped me more than you know." Their conversations grew longer and more personal. Henry told her about his dreams of having his own piece of land someday. Nothing grand. Just enough for some horses and cattle and a house that was truly his. Margaret spoke of her early marriage to Thomas's father, how they had been happy despite their poverty, how she had felt blessed with their small family until everything fell apart. "You think you will stay in Oatman?" Henry asked one morning as they watched the sunrise paint the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. "I have nowhere else to go," Margaret said. "My people are all gone or scattered. At least here I have Thomas and this house and a few familiar faces." "You have me," Henry said quietly. Margaret turned to look at him, her heart beating faster. "Do I, for as long as you want." He reached across the space between them and took her hand, his calloused palm warm against hers. "Margaret, I know it has not been long and people will talk, but I feel something when I am with you. Like maybe I could stop running, like maybe I found something worth staying for." She should have pulled her hand away, should have told him it was too soon, too fast, too everything. But instead she held on tight, this lifeline in the darkness. I feel it too. It terrifies me. Me too, Henry admitted. I lost Jacob and thought I would never care about anyone again. Caring means risking more loss, and I did not think I could survive it a second time. But then I saw you here, keeping watch over your boy, and I recognized that grief. And I wanted to share it with you so neither of us had to carry it alone. Is that what this is? Shared grief? Margaret asked, needing to understand. Henry was quiet for a long moment, his thumb rubbing gentle circles on the back of her hand. It started that way. But it is becoming something more, at least for me. I wake up thinking about seeing you. I look forward to these mornings more than anything else in my life, and I find myself imagining a future that includes you in it. Margaret closed her eyes, overwhelmed by the confession and by her own responding feelings. She had loved her husband, grieved him deeply, and then lost her son before she had fully healed from that first loss. The idea of opening her heart again seemed impossible, a risk too great to take. But Henry made her want to try. I am afraid, she whispered. So am I. He squeezed her hand. But maybe we can be afraid together. She opened her eyes and found him watching her with such tenderness that it took her breath away. Thomas would want me to be happy, she said slowly, working through her thoughts out loud. Before he died, before the fever took his mind, he made me promise not to stay alone forever. He said I was too young to give up on life. He sounds like a wise young man. He was. Fresh tears spilled down Margaret's cheeks, but they were different now, mingled with something other than pure grief. He was so good, Henry, and he is gone and nothing will ever be right again, but you make it hurt a little less. Henry moved closer, releasing her hand only to wrap his arm around her shoulders, pulling her against his side. Margaret stiffened for just a moment, then melted into his warmth, resting her head on his shoulder. They sat that way for a long time, holding each other up, watching the sun climb higher in the Arizona sky. Over the following weeks, their relationship deepened. They still met each morning at the cemetery, but now they also began spending time together in town. Henry would walk Margaret to the general store, carrying her purchases. They attended Sunday service together, sitting side by side in the back pew. He helped repair her sagging porch and fix the loose shutter that had been banging in the wind for months. The gossip intensified. Some people thought it was beautiful how they had found each other in grief. Others clucked their tongues and said Margaret was disrespecting her son's memory by moving on so quickly. The judgmental ones cut her in the street or whispered loudly enough for her to hear their disapproval. One afternoon, Mrs. Pemberton, the banker's wife and self-appointed moral authority of Oatman, confronted Margaret outside the post office. "Mrs. Elsworth, I feel it is my Christian duty to speak plainly. Your behavior with that cowboy is unseemly. Your son has barely been in the ground 2 months." Margaret felt anger flare hot in her chest, an emotion that cut through the fog of grief with clarifying sharpness. "My son is dead, Mrs. Pemberton. He will be dead tomorrow and next month and forever after. How long would you have me mourn? A year? 5 years? The rest of my life?" "I simply think that propriety requires a period of mourning before pursuing romantic entanglements," Mrs. Pemberton sniffed. "Henry Dalton has been a friend when I needed one. He asks nothing of me except to let him share my sorrow because he carries his own. If that offends your sense of propriety, then perhaps your propriety matters more than compassion." Margaret surprised herself with the strength in her voice. She had always been quiet, deferring to others, but grief had stripped away her concern for social niceties. Mrs. Pemberton's face reddened. "Well, I never. You will find yourself ostracized if you continue down this path." "Then I will be ostracized. I have already lost everything that truly matters. I am not afraid of losing the good opinion of people who value appearance over human feeling." Margaret swept past the shocked woman, her head high. When she told Henry about the encounter that evening as they sat on her porch watching the sunset, he shook his head ruefully. "I have brought trouble to your door. Perhaps I should stay away for a while, let things settle." "No." Margaret said it with such force that Henry looked at her in surprise. "No, I am done caring what people think. I have walked through fire, Henry. I have lost my husband and my child. If I can survive that, I can survive gossip." Henry took her hand, lifting it to his lips and pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "You are stronger than you know." "I am only strong when you are near," Margaret admitted. "Alone, I feel like I am falling apart, but with you, I remember how to stand up straight." "Then I will stay near, for as long as you will have me." Summer deepened into fall, and the brutal heat of the Arizona desert began to ease. Margaret marked time by her visits to Thomas's grave, which gradually shifted from desperate vigils to quiet conversations. She brought flowers when she could find them, tidied the area around the cross, and told Thomas about her days. She spoke to him about Henry, asking her dead son for permission to love again, even as she knew it was a question without an answer. Henry continued to visit Jacob's grave as well, but now they went together, keeping watch over both graves, two families joined by loss and growing love. Henry told Jacob about Margaret, about how she made him want to build a life instead of just drifting through one. Margaret found comfort in hearing Henry speak to his brother, knowing that their dead were not forgotten but woven into the fabric of their continuing lives. One morning in October, as the air finally held a hint of coolness, Henry arrived at the cemetery with something other than breakfast. He sat beside Margaret at Thomas's grave and pulled a small wooden box from his pocket. "I have been doing a lot of thinking," he said, his voice nervous, "about my life and where I am headed. For months after Jacob died, I had no direction, no purpose. I was just existing, going through the motions. But then I met you and everything changed." Margaret's heart began to pound. She knew what was coming, felt it in the air between them. "Margaret, I know we have not known each other long. And I know the circumstances of our meeting were born from sorrow. But what has grown between us is real and true and good. You make me want to be better, to build something lasting. And I think, I hope, that I do the same for you." He opened the box, revealing a simple gold band with a small garnet stone. "This was my mother's ring, the only thing I have left of her. I would be honored if you would wear it, if you would marry me and let me spend the rest of my life trying to make you happy." Tears streamed down Margaret's face, but for the first time in months, they were tears of joy mixed with sorrow. "Henry, I want to say yes, but I am afraid of losing you like I lost everyone else, afraid I will bring you nothing but my grief and broken pieces." "We are all broken pieces," Henry said gently. He took her hand, sliding the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. "But maybe our pieces fit together. Maybe we can build something beautiful from the wreckage." Margaret looked down at the ring, then at Thomas's grave, then at Henry's hopeful, patient face. She thought about what Thomas had said before he died, about how he wanted her to find happiness. She thought about the long, empty years stretching ahead if she said no, years of solitary mourning and slow fading. And she thought about Henry, solid and steady and kind, who understood her sorrow because he carried his own. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will marry you." Henry let out a breath he seemed to have been holding and pulled her into his arms. They held each other in the cemetery where they had met, between the graves of the ones they had loved and lost, and Margaret felt something shift in her chest. Not the erasure of grief, but the beginning of hope alongside it. Room for sorrow and joy to coexist. They were married a month later in a simple ceremony at the small church in Oatman. A few of Henry's friends from the ranch attended, along with some of Margaret's neighbors who approved of the match. Mrs. Pemberton was notably absent, but Margaret found she did not care. She stood beside Henry in her best dress, which was still black for mourning but with a white collar she had sewn on for the occasion, and spoke vows that promised forever. The reverend kept the ceremony brief and dignified, acknowledging the sorrow that had brought them together while blessing the love that grew from it. When Henry kissed her as his wife, Margaret felt as if she were taking her first real breath in months. They moved into Margaret's small house together, Henry bringing his few possessions from the bunkhouse at the ranch. He continued working for the Mitchells, saving every penny he could toward his dream of his own land. Margaret took in sewing and laundry to contribute, and together they built a quiet, simple life. The first months of marriage were an adjustment. They were two wounded people learning to live together, learning each other's rhythms and triggers and tender spots. Some nights Margaret woke crying, trapped in nightmares of watching Thomas die over and over. Henry would hold her until the storm passed, never telling her to be strong or to move on, just offering his presence. Other nights, Henry would wake gasping, dreaming of the moment he learned of Jacob's death, of arriving too late to say goodbye. Margaret learned to recognize the signs, to wake him gently and pull him back from the dark places in his mind. They still visited the cemetery together most mornings, though as winter came on, the visits grew shorter. They would stand at the graves, holding hands, speaking silently to the dead before returning to the living. Gradually, painfully, they began to build joy alongside their sorrow. Henry proved to be a gentle, patient husband. He never rushed Margaret, never demanded more than she could give. Their physical intimacy developed slowly, tentatively, two people learning to trust again. The first time Margaret laughed at something Henry said, really laughed, they both stopped and stared at each other in wonder. The sound of her laughter had become foreign, and hearing it again felt like a small miracle. As winter gave way to spring, Margaret realized one morning that she had not cried the day before. The guilt hit her immediately, as if her dry eyes betrayed Thomas's memory. But then she thought about how she had spent the previous day, working alongside Henry to plant a small garden behind their house, their hands in the soil together, planning for a future that included fresh vegetables and flowers. Thomas would have approved. He had always wanted her to have a garden. One evening in late spring, as they sat on the porch watching the desert come alive with brief, brilliant wildflowers after a rare rain, Henry turned to Margaret with unusual nervousness. "I have something to tell you. Mr. Mitchell is selling off a piece of the ranch, about 20 acres on the eastern edge. Not the best land, but there is water and decent grass. He offered to sell it to me for a price I can almost afford." Margaret's breath caught. "Henry, that is wonderful. I have been saving every penny since we married, and I have enough for half the price. I was thinking I could borrow the rest, pay it off over time, build us a real house there, start our own small ranch." He paused, looking uncertain, but it would be tight financially for a few years. "We would have to sacrifice, work hard, and there is no guarantee of success." "When could we start?" Margaret asked, her eyes shining. Henry laughed, relief flooding his features. "Really? You want to do this?" "I want to build a life with you, Henry. A real life, not just two people surviving together but thriving, creating something new." She took his hand. "Thomas loved horses. If we are going to have a ranch, even a small one, maybe we could raise horses, as a way of honoring his dream." Henry pulled her close, kissing her forehead. "We will raise the finest horses in Arizona." The next months were a flurry of activity. Henry secured the loan from the bank, making Margaret co-sign the papers so the land would belong to both of them equally. They spent every spare moment on the new property, Henry building a small house with his own hands while Margaret helped however she could. She learned to mix mortar and hold boards steady while he hammered. Her hands, which had been soft when she was just a widow keeping house, became calloused and strong. The house was modest, just 3 rooms, but it was theirs in a way the rented house in town had never been. Every nail Henry drove, every window Margaret hung curtains in, represented their shared future. They moved in on a blazing hot day in July, carrying their few possessions across the threshold of their new life. That night, lying in their bed in their new house with the desert wind singing through the cracks in the walls, Margaret whispered, "I am happy. I did not think I could ever feel happy again, but I am." "So am I," Henry replied, his arm around her waist. "I thought happiness died with Jacob. But it was just sleeping, waiting for you to wake it up again." They began building their horse herd slowly, buying young horses that Henry broke and trained with a patience and gentleness that made Margaret love him even more. He had a gift with animals, understanding their fear and pain in ways that came from his own experiences of both. The horses responded to him, and word began to spread that Henry Dalton could turn the wildest Mustang into a reliable mount. Business was slow at first, but steady. They lived frugally, every penny going back into the ranch or toward the loan. Margaret kept a vegetable garden that provided most of their food, and she continued taking and sewing to earn extra money. It was hard work, often exhausting, but Margaret found purpose in it. She was building something, creating a legacy not just for herself and Henry, but in some way for Thomas too. On the first anniversary of Thomas's death, Margaret and Henry rode to the cemetery in Oatman together. Margaret had worried that the day would destroy her, that the weight of grief would crush her back down. But standing at her son's grave with Henry's hand in hers, she found that the pain had transformed into something different. Still present, still real, but no longer all-consuming. "I miss him every day," she said, placing fresh flowers on the grave. "But I am learning to carry the missing with me instead of letting it bury me." "That is all we can do," Henry said. "Carry them with us and try to live in a way that would make them proud." They stood in silence for a while, then visited Jacob's grave as well. The brothers would have liked each other, Margaret thought. Both good men taken too soon, leaving behind people who loved them fiercely. As summer turned to fall, Margaret began to suspect something that both thrilled and terrified her. Her monthly courses had stopped, and she felt a familiar nausea in the mornings. She had been pregnant once before with Thomas and recognized the signs. But she was also afraid to hope, afraid to tell Henry, afraid that speaking it aloud would jinx the fragile new life growing inside her. When she finally told him one evening after supper, Henry went very still. "Are you certain?" "I think so. It is still early, but I feel it." Henry's reaction was not what she expected. Instead of joy, his face showed stark fear. "Margaret, I cannot lose you. If something were to happen during the birth, if I had to choose, I would choose you every time." Understanding flooded through her. He was as terrified as she was, haunted by the possibility of more loss. "Henry, look at me. I am strong and I am healthy. Women have babies every day. We will be fine." "You cannot promise that." His voice was raw. "No, I cannot. Life promises nothing, and we both know that better than most. But we cannot let fear stop us from living." She took his hands, placing them on her still flat stomach. "This child is a gift, a chance to create life instead of just mourning death. Are you not tired of being afraid?" Henry closed his eyes, and she saw him wrestling with his demons. Finally, he opened them and pulled her into a fierce embrace. "Yes, I am tired of fear. I want to choose hope. I want this baby, and I want you, and I want to believe that good things can happen to people like us." They held each other as the sun set over their land. Two survivors choosing to believe in the future, despite everything life had taught them about loss. The pregnancy progressed normally, though Margaret tired easily and Henry fussed over her constantly. He took over most of the heavy work on the ranch, refusing to let her do anything he deemed too strenuous. It drove Margaret crazy at times, but she also found his protectiveness endearing. He loved her fiercely, and this baby represented all his hopes for a future he had thought was lost to him. Winter came, and with it the baby. Margaret's labor started on a cold January night in 1886, 2 years after Thomas had died. Henry rode through the darkness to fetch the midwife from town, his heart in his throat, terrified that history would repeat itself and steal someone else he loved. But when he returned with Mrs. Garcia, the midwife who had delivered half the babies in Oatman, Margaret was still laboring strong. Mrs. Garcia shooed him out of the bedroom, telling him to boil water and stay out of the way. Henry paced the small house like a caged animal, jumping at every cry from the bedroom, praying to a God he was not sure listened to people like him. Dawn was breaking when he heard it, the thin, angry wail of a newborn. Henry froze, afraid to hope. Then Mrs. Garcia opened the door, smiling. "You have a son, Mr. Dalton, a big, healthy boy, and your wife is tired but well." Henry's knees went weak with relief. "Can I see them? Give me a moment to clean up, then yes." When he finally entered the bedroom, the sight that greeted him brought tears to his eyes. Margaret lay in bed, pale and exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in blankets. She looked up at him with a smile that lit her entire face. "Henry, come meet your son." He approached slowly, reverently, and looked down at the infant in her arms. The baby had stopped crying and was looking around with unfocused eyes, his tiny fist waving in the air. He had dark hair like Henry and a strong cry that suggested he would be a force to reckon with. "He is perfect," Henry whispered. "You are amazing. I was so afraid." "I know. So was I." Margaret shifted the baby so Henry could take him. Carefully, as if the infant might shatter, Henry cradled his son. The baby was surprisingly heavy, solid, and real in his arms. "What should we name him?" Henry asked. Margaret had been thinking about this for months. "I want to name him Jacob Thomas, after both of them, so they are part of this new life we are building." Henry's eyes filled with tears. "They would be honored, and so am I." He leaned down and kissed Margaret's forehead. "Thank you. For this child, for this life, for being brave enough to love me when we were both so broken." "We are still broken," Margaret said softly, "but we are healing together. And now we have this little one to help us remember how to hope." Baby Jacob was a healthy, demanding infant who kept them both busy around the clock. Margaret nursed him while Henry handled the ranch work and took over the cooking. They survived on little sleep and massive amounts of coffee, but neither complained. This child represented their triumph over grief, proof that life could bring joy after sorrow. As Jacob grew, Margaret saw both Thomas and Henry in his features. He had her late husband's nose and her own green eyes, but Henry's serious expression and strong build. She loved watching Henry with his son, seeing the cowboy who had promised never to leave her transform into a devoted father who sang lullabies and walked the floor at 3 in the morning with a colicky baby. The ranch continued to grow slowly. Word spread about Henry's skill with horses, and more customers came seeking his services. They purchased a few cattle as well, diversifying so they were not dependent on one source of income. Money was still tight, but they were making their loan payments and even saving a little. Margaret kept up her sewing work when she could, taking in mending and making clothes for families in town. She brought Jacob with her, the baby sleeping in a basket at her feet while she stitched. The women who had gossiped about her hasty remarriage now cooed over her infant son, and Margaret found herself welcomed back into the social fabric of Oatman. Even Mrs. Pemberton eventually softened, stopping Margaret one day to admire Jacob. "He is a beautiful baby, Mrs. Dalton. You and your husband must be very proud." "We are, thank you," Margaret said, surprised by the woman's friendliness. "I owe you an apology," Mrs. Pemberton said stiffly. "I judged you harshly when you were grieving. I see now that you and Mr. Dalton have built a good life together." "I was wrong to criticize." It was not a fulsome apology, but Margaret accepted it graciously. "Thank you for saying so. It means a great deal." As Mrs. Pemberton walked away, Margaret looked down at Jacob, who was gnawing on his fist and drooling contentedly. "Your papa and I have come a long way," she told him. "From two people drowning in sorrow to this, a family. Your big brother Thomas would have loved you so much." She still visited Thomas's grave regularly, though now she brought Jacob with her. She would tell Thomas about the ranch, about Henry, about his baby brother. She spoke to her dead son as if he could hear, maintaining that connection even as her life moved forward. Henry went with her sometimes, and they would stand together between the graves of Jacob Dalton and Thomas Elsworth, their son in Henry's arms, a living bridge between past and future. 2 years passed, and then 3. Jacob grew into a sturdy toddler who loved the horses and followed his father everywhere. Henry taught him to be gentle with the animals, to approach them with respect and patience. Margaret watched her son and husband together and felt her heart swell with gratitude for this life they had built. The ranch became profitable enough that they paid off their loan early. The day Henry made the final payment, he came home and swept Margaret into his arms, spinning her around while Jacob shrieked with laughter and demanded to be picked up too. "We did it," Henry said, his face glowing with pride. "The land is ours, free and clear, and we did it together." That night, after Jacob was asleep, they sat on the porch of their house and looked out over their property. The moon was bright, illuminating the pastures where their horses grazed peacefully. "You remember the day we met?" Margaret asked. "In the cemetery, both of us so lost in grief we could barely function." "I remember thinking you were the saddest thing I had ever seen," Henry said, "and recognizing that sadness because it matched my own." "I thought I would die of grief," Margaret admitted. "Every morning I woke up and could not believe I had to keep going without Thomas. And then you sat down beside me and just existed with me in that pain. You did not try to fix it or tell me it would get better. You just shared it." "I needed you as much as you needed me," Henry said. "Maybe more." "I was running from my pain, thinking if I never stopped moving it could not catch me. But sitting with you, keeping vigil together, it taught me that you have to face grief before you can move through it." Margaret leaned her head on his shoulder. "I am glad you kept your promise." "What promise?" "That day in the cemetery, when you said you would stay near as long as I wanted you. You have never left, not once. Even when I was difficult and broken and drowning in sorrow, you stayed." Henry wrapped his arm around her. "I will never leave you, Margaret. I made that promise, and I will keep it until my last breath. You and Jacob are my life now, my reason for everything." They sat in comfortable silence, two people who had found each other in the darkest moment and built a love strong enough to withstand anything. More years passed, blessed and ordinary. They expanded the ranch bit by bit, buying adjoining land when it became available. Henry's reputation as a horse trainer spread beyond Oatman, and people came from as far as Kingman to purchase his horses. Margaret's sewing business grew as well, and she eventually taught other women in town, creating a small school of seamstresses. Jacob grew tall and strong with his father's patience and his mother's determination. When he was 8 years old, Margaret became pregnant again. This time there was less fear and more excited anticipation. They had done this before and survived. They could do it again. Their daughter was born in the spring, healthy and loud and opinionated from the start. They named her Rose after no one in particular, because this child represented only the future. She was pure joy, untouched by the grief that had brought her parents together. Henry was utterly besotted with his daughter, letting her wind him around her tiny finger from day one. Margaret watched him cradle Rose and remembered the broken cowboy who had sat beside her in the cemetery, and she marveled at how far they had both come. Jacob was a loving big brother, protective and patient with the baby. Margaret would find him sitting beside Rose's cradle, telling her stories about the horses and the ranch. He mentioned Thomas sometimes, the brother he had never met but heard about constantly. Margaret had made sure both children knew about Thomas, keeping his memory alive even as new memories were made. The house they had built was too small for a family of 4, so they added rooms, Henry and Margaret working together as they had on the original structure. Their home grew organically, spreading out in a rambling fashion that reflected how their family had grown, unexpected and beautiful. On the 10th anniversary of Thomas's death, Margaret made the journey to the cemetery alone. She had not told Henry she was going, needing this private moment with her firstborn. She stood at the grave, older now, with threads of silver in her dark hair and lines around her eyes from squinting in the desert sun and from laughter. "I think you would be proud of me," she told Thomas. "I have built a good life. Your little brother and sister are wonderful. They know all about you. Henry and I are happy, truly happy, and I know that is what you wanted for me." The wind carried the scent of creosote and dust, familiar as breathing. "I miss you every day, my darling boy." Not the sharp, cutting pain it used to be, but a gentle ache, a tender spot in my heart that will always belong to you. You made me a mother. Everything good in my life flows from that gift. She placed flowers on the grave, wildflowers she had picked on the ride into town. "I will keep coming here as long as I am able. You will never be forgotten, Thomas. Never." As she turned to leave, she saw Henry riding toward the cemetery. He dismounted and walked to her, his face full of understanding. "I thought you might want company," he said simply. Margaret took his hand. "Always. I will always want your company." They walked together to Jacob Dalton's grave, which Margaret now visited as often as she did Thomas's. Henry's brother was part of her story too, the loss that had brought Henry to that cemetery on the morning their lives changed forever. "They would be friends, I think," Henry said, looking between the 2 graves. "Thomas and Jacob, similar ages, both good men." "Yes," Margaret agreed. "And they would be happy that their deaths, as terrible as they were, led to something beautiful, to us and to our family." Henry pulled her close. "I have never asked you this, but do you regret it? Marrying me so quickly, building this life when you were still grieving?" Margaret thought about the question seriously before answering. "No, I do not regret it. Was it fast? Yes. Was it unconventional? Absolutely. But it was also right. We found each other when we were both drowning, and we saved each other. I love Thomas, and I will mourn him until I die. But loving you does not diminish that love. It exists alongside it. My heart is big enough for both." "Mine too," Henry said. "I carry Jacob with me always, but there is room for you and our children too. Room for joy and sorrow to coexist." They left the cemetery hand in hand, riding back toward the ranch where their children waited. The sun was setting, painting the Arizona sky in brilliant colors, and Margaret felt a profound sense of peace. Life had broken her, but it had also rebuilt her into something stronger. The scars remained, but they were part of her story, part of what made her who she was. Years continued to pass, each one adding to the tapestry of their life together. Jacob grew into a fine young man who had his father's gift with horses and his mother's steady determination. He took over more of the ranch work as Henry aged, ensuring the legacy they had built would continue. Rose grew into a spirited young woman who refused to be confined by expectations, helping with the horses as much as her brother and learning her mother's sewing skills as well. Margaret and Henry aged together, their hair going gray, their bodies showing the wear of hard work and desert living. But they remained devoted to each other, the bond forged in grief proving unbreakable. They still held hands while sitting on their porch in the evenings. Henry still brought Margaret coffee in bed every morning. And she still looked at him sometimes and marveled that this man, this broken cowboy, had kept his promise to never leave her. One evening, when they were both in their 50s and their children were grown with families of their own, Henry and Margaret made the ride to Oatman together. They visited the cemetery, something they still did several times a year, though their bodies complained more about the journey now. Standing between the graves of Jacob Dalton and Thomas Elsworth, Margaret reflected on the strange path her life had taken. If someone had told me that morning when you first sat beside me that my life would turn out like this, I would not have believed them. I was so sure I was done, that grief would kill me. It almost killed both of us, Henry said, but we found each other just in time. You think they knew? Margaret asked, gesturing to the graves. Thomas and Jacob. Do you think somehow they knew what would happen, that their deaths would bring us together? I like to think so, Henry said. I like to think they are watching over us, pleased that something good came from all that pain. Margaret leaned against her husband, this man who had seen her at her lowest and loved her anyway. Thank you for keeping your promise, for never leaving me, even when I was difficult and broken. Henry kissed the top of her head. Thank you for letting me stay. For trusting me with your heart when you had every reason to keep it locked away. They stood in the cemetery as the sun set, two people who had found each other in the midst of unbearable grief and built a love story that had lasted decades. Their children were grown and happy. Their ranch was successful and thriving. They had grandchildren who would carry their legacy forward, but more than any of that, they had each other. Two broken people who had kept vigil together at their loved ones' graves and discovered that shared sorrow could transform into shared joy. They had promised to never leave each other, and they had kept that promise through everything life threw at them. As darkness fell over the cemetery, Henry and Margaret walked back to their horses, ready to ride home to the life they had built together. Behind them, the graves of Jacob Dalton and Thomas Elsworth stood silent sentinel, marking losses that had somehow led to love. Margaret looked back once before mounting her horse, speaking silently to her son. I am happy, Thomas. I built the life you wanted for me. And I will keep living it with joy and gratitude until I see you again. Then she and Henry rode toward home, toward their ranch and their children and grandchildren, toward the life they had earned through grief and love, and the simple act of refusing to face sorrow alone. The Arizona sky stretched endlessly above them, stars beginning to appear in the gathering darkness, and Margaret felt nothing but gratitude for the cowboy who had joined her vigil and kept his promise to never leave. Their story, born from tragedy, had become one of triumph. Not because the grief disappeared or the pain healed completely, but because they learned to carry it together, to let love grow in the spaces between the sorrow. They built a family, a home, a legacy that honored both the dead and the living. And every morning for the rest of their lives, when Henry brought Margaret her coffee and kissed her forehead, she remembered that morning in the cemetery when he first sat beside her. When two strangers, united by grief, began the journey that would transform them both. The years stretched on, blessed and full. More grandchildren came, the ranch expanded further, and their love only deepened with time. When they were old and gray, they would sit on their porch and tell their grandchildren stories about the people they had lost and the love they had found. They taught their descendants that sorrow and joy were not opposites but companions, that one could mourn deeply and still choose to live fully. Jacob, their eldest, eventually took over the ranch completely, running it with his father's patience and skill. Rose married a merchant from Kingman and opened a dress shop that became the finest in the territory, using the skills her mother had taught her. Both children thrived, building their own happy lives while remaining close to their parents. Margaret and Henry grew old together on the land they had carved from hardship and hope. In their final years, they were inseparable, two people so deeply intertwined that it was hard to remember they had once been separate individuals drowning in separate griefs. When Henry died at the age of 73, peacefully in his sleep with Margaret beside him, she grieved deeply but did not break. She had learned how to survive loss, and more importantly, she had learned that love was worth the inevitable pain of losing it. She buried him in the Oatman Cemetery, near Jacob's grave, and visited both regularly. Margaret lived another 5 years, surrounded by children and grandchildren who loved her fiercely. She spent her final years telling stories, sewing beautiful things, and riding out to the ranch to watch the horses run. She never remarried, content with the love she had known and the life she had lived. When she finally passed, at the age of 76, her children buried her beside Henry in the Oatman Cemetery. Her grave was positioned so that if you stood in the right spot, you could see both Henry's marker and, a few rows away, the grave of Thomas Elsworth. In death as in life, Margaret was surrounded by the men she had loved: her son, whose loss had broken her; her husband, whose love had rebuilt her. Together, their story became legend in Oatman, the widow and the cowboy who found each other in a cemetery and built a love that lasted a lifetime. Their descendants continued the ranch for generations, raising fine horses and strong children on the land Henry and Margaret had claimed. And every generation learned the story of how their family began: two broken people keeping vigil at graves, who discovered that shared sorrow could become shared strength, and that love was always worth the risk of loss. The cemetery in Oatman, Arizona stands still, weathered stone markers bearing silent witness to all the town's joys and sorrows. Among them, 4 graves tell a story of loss and love, of grief transformed into grace. Jacob Dalton and Thomas Elsworth, whose deaths brought 2 strangers together. Henry Dalton and Margaret Elsworth Dalton, who kept their promises to each other and to the dead, building a beautiful life from the ashes of sorrow. And on quiet mornings, when the desert wind whispers through the cemetery and the sun paints the mountains gold, it is easy to imagine 4 spirits at peace, watching over the town and the descendants they left behind, pleased that their story, which began in such darkness, became a testimony to the enduring power of love and the resilience of the human heart.